Hi again, everybody. I'm here with a new awkward drawing video for you. Let's get started. Slideshow. All right, so today's lesson is about drawing the interaction of light and shadow on a body. This is a class or a lesson that we would have kind of engaged with over several days drawing from a model if this was a normal semester, but I developed this virtual lecture to try to share some of that information with you, and I'll be suggesting some exercises that you might do instead of a model-based life drawing experience as well. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so first of all, I guess, let me kick one step back. One thing I would recommend is if you're doing this kind of drawing for the first time, I would highly, highly recommend working this way observationally. So either draw and observe yourself. In terms of lighting, try to control it. I recommend using a desk lamp that you can direct and really let be a single light source for the drawing experience, or the primary light source for the drawing experience. You could either then photograph yourself illuminated by that light source and then work from the photograph, or set yourself in a position where you can be observing yourself in a mirror and reflecting on how you see light and shadow on your own body. All right, I am using a previous life study that I had done as the model for this demonstration. So we're sort of imagining that I'm observing her in real time and space as well. All right, so whenever I teach this lesson, I highly recommend working on a toned paper. It gives you more active agency between, in terms of how you are drawing light itself, instead of just having an eraser and working reductively to create those light shapes. You can use an additive white material like a white colored pencil, a white pastel pencil, white charcoal, which is really the same as a white pastel pencil. Any of those would be good options. Then the tone of the paper gets to be kind of your half tone or your mid tone in terms of the light story that you develop. And then, of course, you'll be working additively with pencil or charcoal to create the shadow shapes that you are describing in the drawing. If you don't have any toned paper with you, a paper bag from the grocery store would create a really lovely tone and tooth to start doing some sketches on. Otherwise, consider coffee staining or tea staining your paper to get that tone. The last thing you could consider is, just laying down a tone with pastel and then spray fixing really well to fix that surface before you start drawing your light and value sketch. All right, now I've just done a simple sort of pencil outline of the subject that I'm going to be looking at light and shadow on her body. So just a simple line drawing. We'll let most of that interior information develop as a value story by suggesting light and shadow on her form as we progress through this PowerPoint presentation. Before we get into describing light and shadow on her form, let's just review the anatomy of the types of shadows and the anatomy of those shadow shapes. So first ones that we're going to look at are form shadows. Form shadows occur as a function of the form or the surface that light is reflecting off of, turning away from its light source. So what we see here, you always, before you encounter a form shadow, you're always going to encounter a clearly illuminated surface. And so that is where we see the brightest light on the form. The light is finding that surface of the form, reflecting back, and we're seeing those illuminated areas of the form as bright or white in the case of the image that we're looking at, the sphere. As we moved past the illuminated area and see that sphere start to round and turn away from the light source, you start encountering a series of tonal shifts. You'll find the half tone as you move past that illuminated area. That is how we start. It's usually more of kind of a gradient, moving from the lightest bright that we see progressively to the darkest shape in our shadow, and that is what we'd call the form shadow core or the terminator. You encounter that core shadow or shadow core at the moment that the object fully turns away from the light source, and instead of the light hitting the surface, it moves completely past the form itself. And so at that moment where the form's turned away from its light source and no longer illuminated, you get your darkest value in shadow shape. All right. Now, one would think that if the form has turned away from the light source, the whole other half of that form would stay dark. But what is interesting is you usually have a secondary light source visible when you're looking at that form shadow. What that has to do with is it's the reflected light shape. And the source of that light is actually the same source as our original direct light source, but it's those beams that were missing. It was those beams that were missing the form initially. They keep traveling and ultimately will find another surface to illuminate and reflect off of. Once they reflect off, sometimes they find the surface of our form again. And that's where you get that secondary area of illumination. Does that make sense? So our original light coming down, it's not necessarily hitting our form anymore, but the light continues down to find that floorscape and reflects back on to that underside of the surface. So your reflected light is usually sitting opposite your direct light source because some of its light is being absorbed into the floor surface, and we're getting a secondary kind of reflected light. You usually, when you encounter the reflected light, it's not as bright as the direct light source. You also get a little bit of temperature cooling. The light won't look as warm when it's reflected back as reflected light. So that can be another thing to sort of nuance in your toned in your light and shadow drawing, and I'll teach you how to do that in later steps. All right, so those are kind of the basics of form shadow. Let's look at cast shadow now. Now, cast shadows occur as light voids. So the way their story starts is kind of similar. So we have a strong directional light source coming down and finding the surface of the object, and once again creating an area of that object that's illuminated where the light is reflecting off that surface, and that area looks really bright. The cast shadow, though, is a function of the fact that as the light is being reflected off that surface, that same surface of the object is also blocking the light from traveling through or behind that object. So in the areas where that passage of light is interrupted and reflected back by the object, behind it, a light void is created. And so that's where we encounter a cast shadow. So the area that the object blocks from the traveling passage of light, is where you're going to see a cast shadow. Because the object itself is blocking that passage of light, or interrupting is probably a better word, the passage of light, you will see that cast shadow shape has a lot to do with the shape of the original object. Depending on the direction and position and height of the light choice, it helps determine the length of the cast shadows. If it's a higher light source that's more directly above the object, you'll get a shorter shadow cast behind it. If it is a lower light source further away, you'll start getting longer shadows cast from the object. Cast shadows, in terms of the anatomy of their shadow shape, they are going to have the sharpest edges and the darkest value closest to the object. As the shadow stretches away from the object that's creating it, you'll see the value get lighter, and the edges of that shadow shape will become softer. The other thing that's kind of interesting about cast shadows is the surface that they fall onto, or kind of appear on, also informs their shape. So in this example, we have this sphere sitting on a flat surface, and so we see a little bit of stretching of that shadow shape of the sphere, but we also don't see a lot of indication of the topography underneath that cast shadow, which we would if it was falling on a more irregular surface. So if this was cast shadow was falling on a very bumpy, lumpy surface, we would see the edges of the shadow wave and change in response to that surface underneath. So that's something we definitely see happening on the surface of the body, since it stays irregular throughout. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about how to predict that and understand that when we get to later steps of this discussion. All right. So those are the basics of form shadows and cast shadows. I promise I'll get moving a little bit faster. Let's go to the next slide. All right. So coming back to our drawing of our figure on our tone paper, what I want you to do next is I want you on your paper to indicate essentially the position and direction of the light source. If you're doing this observationally, you should be looking at where the light is, and considering where that would be relative to the image of yourself or subject that you're drawing. So for me, my light source was above the model and slightly in front too. All right. Once I've put that light source in, which is sort of my little circle up here, I started creating a series of straight radiating lines. I used my white pencil for this. And I reached them down to every position of the body where I observed that light hitting as bright illuminated shapes. So I just kind of put them down as arrows in the areas that I identify as bright spots on the body's surface. All right. So go through and do that. The straight lines that connect the light to the bright spots help me understand the angle and direction of the light that's finding the body. After I make the illuminated shapes that I observe a bit more specific by just taking my pencil and indicating the edges of the illuminated planes that I see. So usually these lights aren't occurring as just little singular points. I'm seeing sides of the body, larger connected shapes can be illuminated throughout the body, and that's what I'm indicating with these little slight pencil edges that I've added at this stage. Next, I'm going to start suggesting that those shapes are illuminated. And to reinforce the fact that they're illuminated by a directional light source, I'm going to allow the directions of my marks that I use to illuminate the figure relate really directly to the direction of these radiating lines that I drew initially. So you can see my directional hatchwork is staying very regular. Even if you decide to blend it, I would say, you know, work thoughtfully in the directions of the light source. This is a trick use or technique, I should call it, that you see in a lot of masterworks, and it does something really magical in terms of creating a kind of mark that suggests or emulates sunlight, that sort of consistent dabbling light that moves over the body in a really gentle way in drawings. So yeah, look at different masterworks. I promise you'll see the technique and absolutely try it yourself. It's really kind of magic. All right, so I've done that all the way through the illuminated planes of the body. All right, the next thing we're going to start doing is we're going to start adding the shadows. I'm going to suggest be thinking about adding the form shadows first, because what we really have done in terms of starting our light is we've started thinking about where the light's hitting the body. So next I want you to think about where it's not so much. You'll remember from that sphere form shadow demo, we have the highlighted and illuminated plane, and then as we move to the edges of the highlighted planes, we start seeing what's called the halftone area, that gradient as the forms start moving away from the light source. On the body, because we aren't just a regular sphere, we're organic, changing shape, you'll see different parts of the body move more quickly or more slowly away from the light source. That's definitely something that you should observe and draw as you go. Initially, I want you to think about using the tone of your paper as that halftone. And then we'll start building gradients that make that transition from light to shadow faster or slower as is appropriate based on where in the body you're looking. All right, so we got illuminated plane. I now have areas that I sort of understand as sort of half tone or middle gray throughout the body. And then just softly, without any clear directional mark, like use like a soft charcoal or a soft graphite that you've blended and then cleaned up the edges with the eraser. I am just dropping in some simple shadow shapes on my body. Now it's time to describe the form shadows. For the form shadows, because they are directly connected to the shape of the form, using a kind of mark making that's really going to help you articulate and describe what the form is doing clearly is really helpful. We've been working a lot with transverse directional hatching in this class, and that's what I would suggest to use here. I've left it very marky, but you could also work with those directional marks to define the directions of the form, and then softly come back in the same directions with a tortillon or blending stump to soften the edges of those lines and make a more softer tonal transitions, which can help create the illusion of skin surfaces. All right, so you can see my marks that relate to the areas that the form is turning away from the light source or moving across the body explaining the volumes and directions of the forms that I'm seeing. I'm also letting those shapes build and accumulate so that I start getting specific transitions from that half tone slowly into shadow shape and ultimately showing the distinct darkest shadow cores where the light, at the moments that the light misses the form completely. All right, after that, to finish the other side of that form shadow, I'm going to be looking for and adding my reflected light. So remember, reflected light occurs after our direct light misses the body, but finds another surface to reflect on. That reflected light bounces back and it finds the body again. So again, it's that secondary, it's coming from kind of a secondary light source there. So you end up with that light looking a little bit softer and a little bit cooler. A neat thing about layering your additive white pastel over some of those shadow shapes that you created is just as a function of how those materials layer and blend. The white additive white pastel always goes a little bit bluer or cooler when it's layered over the darker grit of the charcoal or the pastel. And that's just really convenient when you are trying to create reflected light, because really that's often what reflective light does naturally too. So give it a try. Try just, without erasing your shadow shapes, try just layering a little bit of the additive pastel over and see if it feels like a natural effect to you. I did this work digitally, so I was able to turn off some layers and isolate just the areas that I added reflected light in the detail here. I just wanted you to see that this is done rather subtly and conservatively. The reflected light choice should feel less strong and prominent than its direct light partner. All right, next let's add cast shadows. So one thing to tell you about cast shadows is while they are almost always occurring, especially if you have strongly illuminated your subject matter, they can be really deceptive, especially when you are, trying to describe a form in 2D rather than 3D. So so just take it or leave it, but a lot of artists take some artistic license and liberties in describing cast shadows, and I'll get into that a little bit now. So one thing is, cast shadows, well, really truly are a light void. So typically if you're encountering them on a body, they are disguising a lot of the information about the form that you would expect to see. And so if you just draw the cast shadow, sometimes it can end up flattening and sort of confounding some of your information in a way that can be really disruptive to the drawing. So one thing artists do quite often, which is actually contrary to what's usually happening in nature, is they will draw form shadows underneath the cast shadows, which is honestly not something you would often actually see, but it can be really helpful. So you can see it, I've done it a little bit right here and also under the breast. I established the form shadows where they would belong, where the form would be turning away from the light source first. And so we still see that sort of line coming off the sternum and suggesting the ligament that comes down, or tendon that comes down all the way through that body center line. And then I lay the shadow shape over top. So we see both the form shadow information and a cast shadow information. Here we see the stronger form shadow as the body turns away through the rib cage and the abdomen, turns away from the light source. But then we also see the cast shadow of the breast beside it. So that's one suggestion that I have. The other thing that artists do all the time is they pick and choose which cast shadows they want to show, and sometimes they don't include cast shadows at all, so you can consider that too. If you are including the cast shadows, the things to observe and think about is, and how to recognize them is, one, look kind of back towards, as you see a cast shadow, look back towards the light source and identify what shape is creating that light void. So in this case, it's definitely the breast, and we can see that the edge of the shape of the cast shadow looks a lot like the edge of the shadow core that sits above it. So that's the first thing to look for. The other thing, remember, a cast shadow sort of falls like a blanket over the surface, the topography of the surface that it falls on. So if you see any kind of warping or distorting of that shadow shape, think about how that is relating to the surface underneath, and make sure that the shadows you're drawing are aligning with the topographical shapes that they should for the surface that they're landing on. All right. Is there anything else? And then lastly, I would say draw the cast shadows differently than the form shadows. So instead of using a strong directional mark, switch back to maybe a softly blended mark with your pencil or your charcoal, and then allow the edges of those shapes to be sharpest, closest to the casting form, and then go back with sort of your finger eraser to lighten and soften the shapes as they move away or further from their source. Make sense? All right, and so here I've turned off all the layers except for my direct light source, just so you can identify the kind of predictable shapes of the body that we'd get cast shadows of. That projecting shape of the nose, chin, breasts, and this is maybe the most kind of unpredictable one, but this forearm is casting this long shadow on to the thigh. And then the roundness of the thigh is also warping that shape a little bit further. All right, next step, erase your light source, because you don't usually actually see the direction of light until it finds a surface to land on, or unless the atmosphere is really, really thick with dust or something. And then as the very last step, go back and nuance your light shapes so that they feel more related in character to the form shadows that you created. By this, I'm not suggesting redirect the directions of your marks, but remember, with soft organic shapes like you're going to find in the body usually, certain areas will turn towards and away from the light a little bit more gently, and you'll be seeing a few different value steps even on the light side before we get to our halftone and start moving into the shadow. So just sort of creating gradients, going back with your clickable eraser and blending stump, and sort of softening the edges of those illuminated planes is really helpful. And that is it. Thank you.